I'd like to call the December 8th, 2011 meeting of Williamsburg City Council to order. Ms. Scott, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Knudsen?
Here.
Mr. Pons?
Here.
Mayor Holman?
Here.
Mr. Fryling?
Here.
Mr. Foster?
Here.
Our first order of business today is council minutes from the meetings of November 7th and November 10th, 2011. Do I have any additions or corrections? Not.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we approve the council meeting minutes from November 7th and November 10th, 2011.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please, Ms. Scott?
Ms. Knudsen?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryling?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
Our next order of business is matters of special privilege, and today I'd like to take a brief bit of time to talk a little bit about an incident that occurred at Berkeley School recently. As you know, we had heard earlier from the Berkeley PTA, and the city manager, the police chief, and I will be meeting with representatives of the PTA and the principal on December 14th. Our focus is to determine what's best for the children and what's the best use of taxpayers' resources to serve those students. I'd like to ask Chief Slogey to come forward to give us a little bit of a report on the incident, and following that, I'd like for him and the city manager to tell us a bit about the role of the school resource officer and how that relates to a security officer. Chief,
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mayor, Council, we did have an incident out there on the 30th of November at Berkeley School. There was a fight in the cafeteria, basically started by someone trying to cut in line. The student was injured, went to the nurse's office where he was treated. I believe that James City, I talked to Chief Dent, James City medics arrived on the call. There was no transport to the hospital. I saw in the paper where he was transported to Centera, and knowing about the case, I ended up talking with Greg Riley, our investigator in charge, and he contacted the parent again, and we did find out, as we thought before, there was no treatment that was necessary for the child. No trips to Centera, no trips to any other doctor. We also have an SRO officer, Dennis Baines, who's at Berkeley. He's there on a part-time basis. He's there 5 days a week. He's there every morning, and he's there several afternoons. He left on this particular day at 10:13, about a half an hour before. He's there as a part-time basis because he has other duties. He's our only community service officer, so he's responsible for every other aspect of Neighborhood Watch and Project Lifesaver. So we have a part-time, very similar to James City. One of James City's two middle schools has a part-time SRO. There is a situation when it comes to resources where that's probably the first place we will pull somebody for other cases. For example, right now we have 5 people out, 1 in the academy and 4 on FMLA, and when you have 36 officers, that's going to pool from those resources. But we have a presence there in Berkeley School. We have a presence not only by the school resource officer, but over the last couple of years. We stopped the permanent resource officer there back in 2009. Our presence there has been not only Officer Baines, but numerous officers have gone by the school for purposes of security. Now, the school resource officers are not there just for security. But in fact, I've also met with Sheriff Deeds. Any issues come up, their vicinity to the school is extremely close. The courthouse is right across the street, so in an emergency we can respond very rapidly. The vicinity to Williamsburg to Berkeley is very, very, very close, so we can respond rapidly. So I think right now we're moving forward. I wish Dennis had been there during this incident, but generally speaking, the school resource officers aren't disciplinary monitors in the cafeteria. They're there to work with the students, to deal with any issues that come up, any criminal activity they will deal with. They will take a report, and we will proceed to the Commonwealth Attorney or juvenile to obtain petitions. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Chief. Just, Jack, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think the Chief really covered any point I would have made about not only what happened in this case, but what school resource officers do and what they do not do and what their purpose is, and I think he covered that very well.
Great. Does anybody on council have any questions for the chief or for city manager?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. And again, Chief Slogee, the city manager, and I will be meeting with representatives from the PTA and the principal on December 14th. Thank you. Our next order of business is background presentations, and this is a presentation by the Chair of the Finance and Audit Committee, Ann Wall, Audit Manager, and Phil Serra, Finance Director. And this is a report on the comprehensive annual financial report for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2011. The city's Finance and Audit Committee meets annually to discuss the audit report. That meeting was held yesterday. The committees consist of me as chair, Gwen Williams, and Bob Taylor. The Finance and Audit Committee meets with auditors and staff to discuss the audit engagement, internal controls, and for a briefing on the financial report and results of operations for the year. Also, an important part of the meeting is to discuss concerns that the independent auditors may have regarding internal controls, staff training, or anything they feel needs to be discussed based on their review of the financial systems and procedures in place during that fiscal year. The committee heard a presentation from Ann Wall, manager with Robinson, Farmer and Cox Associates, centered on the audit engagement, internal controls, and accounting standards. The finance director, Phil Serra, gave a presentation on operating results and the financial position at the end of the year. Following those presentations, the committee voted to accept the report and forward it to City Council. Minutes of that meeting will be distributed next week. Today we have with us Ann Wall, Audit Manager from Robinson, Farmer and Cox Associates. She will speak briefly about the audit engagement. She will be followed by Finance Director Phil Serra, who will present the results of operations for the year, and following their reports, we will come back to City Council for any questions they may have. Ann, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here just to really report to you about the audit that we recently conducted on the city's comprehensive annual financial report for June 30th, 2011. As you all know, the city's required to get an annual audit conducted each year. It's required under the Code of Virginia. As part of our audit engagement, there's really kind of three components to the audit, which the mayor really kind of touched on all of them: the financial statement presentation, internal control review, and then the federal compliance opinion. So there's three opinions within this financial document in all of those areas. The financial statement presentation was unqualified, and our opinion was unqualified in that area, and that's on page 1 of the audit report. The other two opinions are really towards the back of the report. If you were looking at it, they're in the compliance section, and they have to do with our evaluation and review of your internal controls, and then our review of some federal program dollars that the city receives. And the way these opinions are laid out, it's really more what's not the absence of anything to report. So there's no internal control material weaknesses or deficiencies to report here in your internal control opinion, nor were there any federal compliance issues that we unearthed in our review of your federal program dollars. This report has been filed with the Auditor of Public Accounts in accordance with the November 30th deadline, and your comparative cost report forms were completed as well. I want to report to you that we didn't have any disagreements with management on any accounting matters or that kind of thing. The staff that we work with, not just in the finance department, but in the other areas, in the utilities department, the Commissioner of Revenue Office, social services, they all really come under the umbrella of the audit, and everybody was very receptive and helpful when we asked questions and made themselves available to us, and we appreciate that. This report will be submitted to the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, in their certificate program, of which the city has participated in, and I believe we assume it'll be acceptable to achieve that award again this year. We did not issue a management letter in accordance with this, the audit this year, but it doesn't mean that we didn't, talk about internal control matters while we were on site, but nothing rose to any level that needed to be included in a management letter. There was one new accounting standard that was applicable this year has to do with GASB 54, Governmental Accounting Standards number 54, and it had to do with fund balance reporting. And I believe the City Council adopted a fund balance reporting policy at your June 2011 meeting that complied with those new categories of fund balance reporting. And there is some additional footnote disclosure in this report relative to that accounting standard. That really concludes my comments related to the audit. But again, it was unqualified opinions in all three areas, and I think Phil's.
And thank you very much for that. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Phil?
Mayor Hallman, members of council, I'll go over the highlights from the audit report ended in June, talk about the results of operations for the general and utility funds, fund balance for the general fund, and reserve policies and working capital for the utility fund. We'll show you the graph that we continue to maintain on expenditure and revenue trends, and we'll talk a little bit about the RS pension funding. Revenues for the year for the general fund, and this always includes the sales tax fund, and when we're talking in the capper, actual revenues for the year came in at $36.9 million, about $300,000 higher than they were for last year, which is about 0.8%. The expenditures came in at $35.9 million, about $1 million lower than revenues for the year, 3.8% lower than total expenditures from last year. And in regards to the operating revenues, and this does not include the sales tax fund, this is the actual general fund operations, revenues over budget for the year totaled $975,000. Property taxes were about $159,000 over budget, mostly from personal property taxes. Other local taxes, almost $700,000 over budget, and that relates to the increase in room and meal that we experienced during FY11. Use of money and property was up almost $80,000, and that's related directly toward the Prince George parking garage, coming in well over budget. Intergovernmental was over by a combination of three things: recordation taxes, state sales tax for education, and state street maintenance monies came in higher than we anticipated. Expenditures were under budget by almost $1.4 million for the year. City departments were the major savings area for the year, almost $1.3 million alone right there. The jail was over budget, $108,000, and we knew that. We've had the declining populations at the jail, so we knew that was going to happen. Same with juvenile detention. The WADMAC money is a pass-through, so that's not an issue there. But $1.37 million under budget. And we'll talk a little about the city department, since that was the big savings area. They're broken down into the operations, salaries and benefits, and capital outlay. The biggest, of course, is the savings in operational accounts citywide. There was savings in the contingency line item. The transfer to the public assistance fund was under what was actually budgeted. There was savings in the York County contract for E911 dispatch services. And then there was a variety of savings in the operational accounts of the police, fire, and various public works departments. Salaries, wages, and associated benefits were under budget almost $400,000. The majority of that was from police and fire through some positions that were open throughout the year. Dental reimbursements were lower than anticipated throughout the city for the entire year. And then there was some savings in some various line items for part-time positions. In capital outlay, there was about $84,000 in savings in some of the various machinery and equipment line items. If you take all that into consideration, the $975,000 revenues over budget with $1.37 million expenditures under budget, total surplus is just over $2.3 million for the year. And graphically, trying to display this is where we ended up right here, about $975,000 over budget on the revenues and about $1.3 million under budget on the expenditures. So you can see that the revenues came in over and expenditures were under. Unlike last year, where all of these savings, the $1.8 million in surplus we had last year, was really on the expenditure savings side of it. And then looking here at the numbers, you can see that we've maintained a consistent surplus for many years, and it started to widen here with the increase in the property assessments. Then the last 5 years, you can see what really happened here with the actual surpluses. The recession really started taking a dip right here. We ended up the year in positive territory, just barely. And we made some adjustments on the operating side, the spending side, to come in the next year quite a bit lower and still make budget with a $1.8 million surplus last year. And then, of course, this is the year ended in June, again, with a $2.3 million difference. This is the graph for all of the governmental funds, which is the general fund, sales tax fund, and also the public assistance fund. And this is just going back 28 years, showing how there's periods of savings in spending right here. These are usually the years of high capital project spending that's budgeted and planned for every year. And we just ended up this year about $1 million difference in total right there, with revenues over higher than expenditures in total. Fund balance for the general fund began the year at $26 million even, adding the revenues of $37 million, taking away expenditures of almost $36 million, and the transfer to the public assistance fund of about $600,000, puts fund balance at the end of June 2011 at $26.5 million. And these are the new categories that Ann mentioned that were consistent with the adoption of policies for GASB Statement 54 that you all did just recently. The assigned fund balance, which is dedicated for carryover capital projects, is $3.4 million. There's about $212,000 assigned for health care. The residual is called unassigned, and that's $22.9 million. In relation to fund balance policy, it's been the policy of the city to have a fund balance of 35% of operating revenues each year. That would mean a minimum of $11.3 million. The unassigned of $22.9 million is actually almost 71% of that. So we're well within the city reserve policy again this year. Cash and investments at year end, there was $8.4 million in checking, with $3 million of that being in CDs, short-term CDs. And the residual, $17.7 million, is invested in the state treasurer's local government investment pool, earning 0.2% annualized per year. So that was the average interest earnings for that. We earned about $88,000 in interest in this fund this year, compared to about $1.4 million 3 or 4 years ago. So the lower rates have really affected the income side for interest income. Looking at the utility fund, revenues and expenses came in about $280,000 higher in revenues than expenses for the year. There were some non-operating accounts that came in, interest income and connection fees of about $100,000. Interest costs on debt were about $300,000. And $1.5 million did come in from Riverside for the tank as a proffer for the year. So the increase in net assets for the year was just over $1.6 million for the utility fund. And then working capital, it's simply the difference between current assets and current liabilities. At the end of the year, it was right at $4.5 million. And the last most important schedule, or one of the most important schedules of pension funding progress. This is from the actuary. The last time that we received the report, we received that a year ago from the June 30th, 2010 valuation, comparing the value of the assets of $42.6 million with the actuarial accrued liability, which is the promise to pay the benefits for all full-time employees under the pension plan, has a gap of $13 million back at that point in time. So we're at 76% funding. We've not received the actual valuation for the year ended in June of this year. We'll get that next month from VRS when they're issued. We do know about the new rates for the next biennium, and we'll be going from current year 16.44% of payroll to 21.29% of payroll. So it's a significant increase. It's going to put pressure on the budget, and we'll deal with it. And graphed out, you can see how back here we were funded over 100% back in 01, right at 100 in 02, and then the gap continued to widen to where it is right now with this $13 million gap. And that's what I have prepared. I'll be glad to answer the questions.
Phil, thank you very much, and Ann, thank you. Having an unqualified opinion with no management letter is very, very good news, and thank you very much for that. And Phil, thank you and your staff for the terrific work you do, and Jack for managing the whole thing. It works very well, and this is a very nice financial report, and very nice to see a $2.3 million surplus at the end of the year. Thank you. Questions?
Sure. Mr. Serra, could you talk briefly about the strategy behind the balance of investment in the LGIP versus CDs?
The strategy there was to keep the LGIP, keep all the money in the LGIP for the past several years. We got into the CD markets 2 years ago just so we could earn some little bit higher rate because the short-term rates were going down. And I will tell you right now, we made a conscious effort to make more interest for the current year. So in July of this year, it didn't show up on the report. We put $14 million into a cash, it's an insured cash account with Promontory Interfinancial Company up in Alexandria. So that's earning about 0.7% right now on $14 million. Virginia Company Bank locally is maintaining the account for us through Promontory. So yes, we have made a conscious effort to increase interest earnings in light of the low rates we're getting because of the low Fed funds rate.
And that will show up next year in the financial report at the end of.
And that money is totally liquid. We can get our hands on it whenever we want, as just like the LGIP.
And based upon the distribution that we have now, do you think we have the appropriate balance between liquidity, security, and return?
I would put more money in there, but we're capped out because of FDIC laws. $14 million is the maximum that we can put in there because you can't put more than 15, so we leave a little leeway in there for interest earnings.
Room to grow?
Yeah. Room to grow. We can't grow any more than 15 million.
And based upon the current status or performance of the utility fund, and our outstanding obligations there, what are you seeing coming down the road with water rates?
This is the ongoing question that I have with the city manager every year. The problem with the utility fund is consumption is unknown. In the last few years, it's gone down. And we have a fixed amount of expenditures, especially with debt in there, financing the money that we did for the Newport News water agreement. So we're probably going to be faced with increasing tax rates again this year.
Well, it's not actually a tax rate. It's a water fee. Yes.
Well, Phil said, every year we go through an analysis of water rates and sewer rates, and we look at our best projections of future expenses and see what we can do not to increase the water rate. And that's the decision we bring to you with the budget documents, and you'll see it in March when we get to that point for discussing next year. So I can't answer the question yet for next year, but I will say that generally the main factor is how much are we going to need to put in capital investment out of current money, and what's the rate of spending on capital. Our fixed costs we know, and we know what we've already done in terms of bond expenditures and those payments. That's clear. But what's the rate of future capital spending, and that's in large part driven not on the water side, but on the wastewater side, with the environmental requirements to continue to upgrade the maintenance of the systems. So it will be an ongoing challenge, and certainly we'll be dealing with it in the specifics in a few months.
And on the pension liability question, the increase from 16% to 21%, is that specific to Williamsburg?
Yes.
Okay. And that's based upon what the gap is in the actual funding and the future liability?
They take a look at all localities. All localities are rated separately. They look at the demographics of the workforce, the age, the life expectancy, everything associated with what actuaries do when they do the valuation. So that's where they came up with. They're saying that the rates need to be that high rate the next 2 years based on the low asset value, and that could change. I mean, that will change depending on the asset value. We don't know which way the asset value is going to go, though.
And the idea is that you need to increase that to close that gap, but we're not going to close it in 2 years. Is it to get us closer to 80%?
It's just to get us closer to 100%.
Okay.
In effect, what you're paying your normal pension costs that you expect, you're also paying off the unfunded portion of the pension, and you're amortizing that over a long period of time. It's 30 or 40 years. But the key assumptions is, what do you assume your rate of return on the investments, the assets will be, and how much contribution needs to go in. Of course, that's what actuaries get paid for, and it's all based on the assumptions they make in terms of both the demographics, the payroll, life expectancy on one side, and what the return on investment will be. So the actuaries look at the particulars of Williamsburg in the Virginia retirement system and come up with their analysis and their recommended contribution rate. And because, as Phil said, the market has performed so poorly in the last few years, the earlier assumptions of asset growth have not taken place. And you saw that on that one chart where our asset values more or less have leveled out and have not continued to grow, and therefore the requirement for a higher contribution rate. And all governments are experiencing this to one degree or the other, but in particularly is the evaluation for each one is separate, therefore the amounts of increase are separate for each one and different.
And that leads me to the last question then. The gap that exists between the current funding and the long-term liability has nothing to do with any city policy regarding budget matters, or it's all related to the flawed assumptions that are put forth by whoever's actuarially determining what we should be contributing?
Well, it's not necessarily flawed assumptions, but it's what actually performed in the market in terms of...
What would you call it? I mean,
well, no. Every
they have
year
to make an
they're
assumption
doing it.
on what the return's going to be.
Yes.
Unrealized assumptions.
Unrealized assumptions, I guess. But I think the point that you made is that the city has always funded 100% of the amount recommended, and by VRS is what is required to achieve to fully take care of the retirement amount. So, yes.
So, assuming all localities are operating under the same general set of external assumptions about how the market's going to do, then everybody will be in the same boat unless they're making extraordinary contributions somehow.
Yes. We're all in the same boat, although the degree changes from locality to locality, and the state as well. We're in better shape than the state. We're not as in good shape as regard to other localities, and all depends on the particulars of that organization.
Is the school system tied in with the state?
Yes.
Thank you.
Scott, any questions?
It's very thorough. Thank you. It's good to have good news, but this pension funding is going to be interesting, and I appreciate Jack's explanation. Thank you.
Doug?
Thank you. Yes, I guess just a point, even different than budget surpluses, which is a good number, and I'm glad to see that we overachieved our revenue and were able to cut expenses different than budget. But the real actual dollars, we did better as well. We were slightly up in revenue, and expenses year after year have gone down, which is a sign of good prudent management and a good testament to city staff and the cuts that they've had to be put through. In addition to the VRS contribution and the burden that's going to cause us in the future, any thought on how assessments may look going forward and how that's going to affect us as well?
We know assessments have affected us drastically the last 2 fiscal years. We're down about 6-7% for the last 2 years. And if you look on the monthly report, the residential sales to date for all of those sales since last June are right at 100%. I wish that were 100% is that's where you want to be. But if some of these sales come in lower than assessed value, yes, the residential side could be again lower next year. And then you have the commercial side also that we're kind of very concerned with. You saw the one sale on that report of one of the hotels this month. So we're really looking at that closely. So we'll have a better indication by say, first part of February, and I'm sure we'll have a conversation about this at the budget retreat in January.
Yeah, good, because clearly it's going to be something that we're going to be having to deal with. Is this available to the public?
Yes, it is.
I found it to be, particularly some of the introduction statements to be very good information for all of the residents. And if you really want to get a kind of a benchmark or kind of an idea of the inflows and outflows of money and some of the constraints that we're dealing with, it's right here in this document. So I'd encourage you, if anybody's really interested, there are the answers.
Yes, it's on the website.
Yep, thank you.
It's called Follow the Money. Judy?
Well, first, I just think we all need to thank the staff. It is just remarkable, the amount of money they have saved, and I know it's not been easy for anybody at this time. Just the other thing, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment or what, we met with our legislative delegation Monday, and one of the things they mentioned about the state budget was that one of the governor's priorities was to what's the word I want? Refund the money to VRS that the state borrowed to help the state. Is that going to do us any good if the state budget tries to do something about VRS?
Yes and no. Yes, in that the better job the state does in funding its pension obligations, it underwrites the health of the whole VRS system. Mm-hmm. It does not affect our particular actuarial analysis and needs.
Yeah.
But as much as the state can do to uphold VRS and do what they need to do, and they're responsible for doing that, that is a good thing.
Thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, sir, certainly.
Can either of you speak to the 2-year time period on the VRS assumptions? I know localities will reassess, some every year, some every 2 years. The ones who've done it every 2 years really run a risk when you come to the down times because you don't know what you're going to get over a longer period of time when the values decrease. Has there been any discussion about VRS being reevaluated every year?
Well, they do the analysis every year, the actuarial analysis. They set the rates every 2 years. So that's their process statewide, as opposed to changing that. And I'm not sure I don't know the justification for that and why they're not doing the adjustments in contribution rates every year rather than every 2 years. But that's the way they've done it for.
But from our standpoint, if they did it every year, it would lessen sort of the
budgetary
impact.
If the swing is going to be wide in one direction or the other, it would tend to level it out.
Right.
That's true. But I think we've been able to see this coming. So we didn't know how much our rate would go up, but we knew it was going up. So we've been anticipating 2013 budget.
So what do you anticipate the dollar value of that increase to mean for our budget for next year? A ballpark.
Between the general fund and utility fund, it's about $430,000 additional dollars
to go for that. Okay. Also, I think Paul's point and the question about the assumptions they make are really critical because they are assuming every position will remain a position in the city into perpetuity and what have you. So when you start getting into it and looking at the assumptions, it's an interesting process. But again, I think it's an issue that has been before us for some time. We're aware of it, and I think it's something that we have to continually keep our finger on as we move forward. Anybody else have any questions for?
This question, and I probably should know the answer to this. Are we mandated to have to put our employees' contribution to retirement into the VRS, or could it be handled, in a private equity firm?
Once the city came in, it was required to stay in.
Okay.
Now, the General Assembly has opened up some options that weren't there before with regard to new employees, but generally speaking, no, we're part of VRS.
And those options have been employees funding a portion of their own retirement. They have not been the option of the city ceasing to participate in VML.
We can't ask for our money back and go to a brokerage house.
Has any of the discussion been in terms of defined contribution rather than defined benefit, or is that something that...
There has been some conversation. Generally, there hasn't been anything specific that has come out.
Okay, right. But that's something we need to keep on our radar as well. Anybody else have any questions? Phil, thank you very much for a terrific presentation, and Ann, thank you very much for the work you did and your firm did, and all the people that were here. And it's always good to hear that when someone comes and works with our staff, that they go away with a smile on their face. So thank you very much for that. Our next order of business is public hearings, and we have one today. This is PCR 11-021. Amend the zoning ordinance to revise membership requirements for the Architectural Review Board. This is proposed ordinance 11-25A and 11-25B. Carolyn.
Mayor Holloman and members of the council, the Architectural Review Board consists of 7 members, one of which is a licensed architect. Our ordinance currently requires all ARB members to live in the city, and one of the 7 is a licensed architect. We have tried to find a licensed architect who lives in the city that would be willing to serve on the board to no avail. Because of the detail and complexity of cases coming before the ARB, a licensed architect we think is needed as one of the 7 members. Therefore, before you today is a request to change the requirement for the licensed architect to live in the city to one who lives in James City County or the Bruton District of York County if they are employed or have an office and have an office in the city. The Planning Commission held a public hearing last month, and no one spoke concerning this change. They recommended approval of the proposed ordinance 11-25B to allow their licensed architect member to be a resident of James City County or the Bruton District of York County if they are employed and have an office in the city. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Any questions for Carolyn?
I do have one question. Based upon your experience with the ARB, which is significant, what's your opinion on the matter?
I think it's very important to have a licensed architect. The state CLG would allow us to have either a licensed architect or an architect historian instead of both if we wanted to. But I think both of those positions are very important to the board, and having been with the board for over 10 years, I think it's very important to have a licensed architect, and that's why we brought forth this change.
Thank you.
Scott?
I particularly appreciate, not that it's just a architect that maintains an office in either of those districts, but maintains an office in the city. I think that's intrinsically tied to the purpose of this position. So,
maybe briefly, can you describe the difference between an architect, a licensed architect, and architectural historian?
Architect historian is someone who has a degree in history, or in architectural design and stuff, in history of it. The licensed architect is someone who's gone to architectural school and has actually gone and take the architectural exam and has become a licensed architect. You can have an architect who's also not a licensed architect, but that's mainly the difference.
Thank you.
Okay, no further questions. With that, I'll open the public hearing. Anyone who wishes to speak to this matter may come forward and do so. Not seeing anyone, I'll close the public hearing and come back to council for discussion and action.
I'd just like to add to Ms. Murphy's comment. From my time on the Architectural Review Board, I found the input of the licensed architect to be particularly valuable on 2 fronts. One is, of course, helping to understand the project as it's being put forth and maybe deciphering some of the information that's there. But also because they know what the architect does and how they do what they do. And that's a very important aspect of the process that if you're not in that profession, it's hard to understand. And I think, although in most cases I would say it's better to have a city resident on a board and commission, in this case where we need a specific skill and where the entire community benefits from that skill, I think it makes sense to look to our neighbors and find the best qualified person who's willing to serve.
Scott?
Well, and I agree. I think to not have an architect on ARB wouldn't be in our best interest. And I think that, as the Mayor says, having somebody who understands that lingo there is an important part of what happens. So, having one versus not having one, I think it's better to have one. And I think anybody, even if they live in a county, yes, it'd be better if they lived in the city, but if they lived in either one of the counties and they're interested and willing to serve, that person has our best interest in mind. And so I think it's an acceptable
Thank you.
change.
Yeah, I think all of us agree, and all of us have seen situations where having the architect there has made a real difference, both in the discussion, in working with the applicant, and getting the best result for both the applicant and the city. So I think with that, if anyone wishes to make a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I move that council approve proposed ordinance 11-25B.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Ms. Scott, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Knudsen?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryland?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
And that takes effect immediately. Correct. Thank you. Our next order of business is reports. First, we have the monthly financial statements. Jack, is there anything in particular you'd like to note?
I would just note on the first sheet on revenues, they're showing running about $300,000 ahead where we were at the same time last year, and that's merely just real estate tax coming in a little quicker than they did last year, so we're really running pretty much right online. It also shows expenditures running about $1 million ahead of last year. A good piece of that is money which is shown in this year's budget, which accrues back to last year. It's already in the last year's statements that you saw. Will be pulled out of this report in December, so we'll get a much truer picture in December of where we are than the November report in that regard. Also, that FEMA money reimbursing us for the expense for the hurricane will no longer distort this year's budget. So that and a few other things explain why we're not actually $1 million further behind this year than we were this time last year, as this statement would appear. And also on page 5, just noting in room, meal, and sales tax. Room tax is down for the year right now, 4.2%. Not good numbers in October, and we are slightly behind budget right now on room tax for the year. We're about on budget for meal tax and for sales tax, although the performance of those vis-a-vis last year is just about level.
Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Monthly departmental operating reports. Okay.
Nothing in particular to point out this month.
Any questions? Okay, city manager reports. We have 3. The first is the Historic Area Public Street Right-of-Way Maintenance Agreement.
Yes, we have an agreement with Colonial Williamsburg going back to the 1950s, where Colonial Williamsburg maintains the streets in the historic area, and with that, everything from taking care of the trees, paying for the street lights, maintaining the sidewalks, picking up trash, and a whole host of other responsibilities. And so the city, rather than going into the historic area with our crews and equipment to do street maintenance, in effect, we contract with Colonial Williamsburg to do that in the historic area. And that's what this agreement is about. This will continue that program for the next 5 years. The rate is for that service is set based on the maintenance expense rate we receive from the Virginia Department of Transportation to maintain city streets, allocated based on the lane mile of streets in the historic area. And so the agreement itself is very similar to the one we've had in the past, just with the dollar rate changing to reflect that methodology for making the payments. So Mr. Clayton is the expert on this, if you have any other questions.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. Any questions?
Maybe just a couple. What is the process for, if the city notices that something needs to be done and it's under their purview, what's the process to communicate that and follow up?
Right. There is a process for that, and Mr. Clayton has his point of contact in the foundation, can say, under the agreement, you need to repair this, and bring it to their attention, and they're responsible for following up on that in a timely manner. So that communication goes that way and two ways. There's provisions also in certain cases where certain capital expense over and above just routine maintenance will need to be done jointly by the city and the foundation, and so we work together on those types of things.
And is there a minimum threshold for public safety that has to be maintained on these public streets? I mean, if the city's managing streets outside, we fix potholes and
Yes.
lifts and sidewalks
Yes.
and that type of thing.
There are performance standards in the agreement, and it's our responsibility to follow up and make sure they're being adhered to.
Sure. And then there was some mention of Colonial Williamsburg having to maintain some liability insurance for anything that may happen.
Occur. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Judy? Okay. We need to take action?
Yes,
on
we need
this?
a motion to approve execution of the agreement.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to move that council authorize the city manager to execute the historic area public street right-of-way maintenance agreement with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please?
If I may,
Yes.
as an employee of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, I'll abstain from voting.
Ms. Scott, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Knudsen?
Aye.
Mr. Ponce?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
And Mr. Foster?
Aye. Okay, our next report is the Verizon Wireless License Agreement.
I ask Mr. Clayton to give this report.
Good afternoon. We're leasing space to 4 wireless communications providers on our Jamestown Road water tank. Verizon Wireless has come to us and requested an amendment to that lease to allow them 3 additional antenna and equipment at the tank site. The additional antenna are needed to accommodate the new technology, the new 4G technology. The amendment also increases the annual rent from $36,000 to $42,000. They have prepared a structural analysis which showed that there were no issues with installing the additional equipment on the tank. The staff has also requested an updated site plan to show what they're going to be doing. If there's any work on the ground, there's not going to be much work on there. We wanted an updated site plan, and they're in the process of doing that. Chris and their legal rep for Verizon has prepared the lease amendment, and basically staff supports the lease amendment contingent upon the receipt and approval of a site plan, and would recommend in council approval.
Great.
On kind of a side note, there's another provider that's on the tank, AT&T, and we are negotiating with those folks at this time now, and more than likely we'll have this same kind of thing come back to you next month, because they're going the 4G route also. So.
Okay. Great, thank you. Could you tell me exactly how the rental rate is determined? Is that?
It's a negotiated rate.
Right.
I mean, I check other localities and other water tank folks, and I can tell you that
A specialized market.
I can tell you that it's on the high side.
Yeah, good.
We've kind of taken advantage of the fact that it's a popular site,
Yeah, right.
and we got a decent rate.
And there is also an escalator in all of the lease agreements, so every 5 years the rent is increased by 5%?
10%.
10%. So this is a lease for 5 years with a renewal if they choose to opt for that. So they have 4 years left on their current period. So in 4 years, the $42,000 will be increased if they choose to continue to lease space on the tower.
Great, thank you. Any other?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Mr. Clayton, I've never noticed the antennae on the tower. Can you tell us how it affects the profile from the street?
It's noticeable if you got to look in the right direction, I guess. These antennae are routinely about 6 feet tall, maybe 9-10 inches wide. And now, like I said, we have 4 providers up there. With these additional antennae, let's see. AT&T will have 9, Verizon will have 6, that's 15, and the other 2 folks, they've got 6 each, that's 12, so you'll have 20-some antenna up there. And they're mounted on the rail, and they're painted the same color as the tank. So it's that's been one of our primary concerns, is the aesthetics. Most everybody's ridden down an interstate and seen some of these water tanks with god-awful stuff hanging all over them. So we've tried to spend a lot of time trying to get these things looking decent, and I give them a hard time about it.
So we're very pleased you didn't notice that.
Well, I must be spending too much time watching the traffic in front of me.
Scott, any questions?
None about this particular, and I think this is fine. Do we have the same opportunities at the new water tower on 60?
We did make provisions on the top of the tank. If you've seen the tank, there's a railing up there, and that will support some antenna. We have the other antenna in the Jamesburg Plaza, the other water tank in Jamesburg Plaza, and there's not much interest there. That tank is closer to the interstate, and the section along the interstate, the corridor, is much better. So apparently the Jamestown tank at 199 and Jamestown Road for the Kings Mill area and towards James River, it works. They need that site.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Chief? Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. Any further questions? If not,
This is just a win-win-win proposition. It's increased revenue for the city. It's providing a service that's going to be increasingly important, particularly for business people and for visitors. And it puts it in a place that's already intruding on the horizon and doesn't really impact the view. I can't see any reason why we wouldn't do it. So, Mr. Mayor, I move the City Council authorize the city manager to execute the First Amendment to the lease agreement with Selco Partnership, contingent upon receipt and approval by the Director of Public Works of a site plan showing the exact location of the additional equipment as provided in the amendment.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please, Ms. Scott?
Ms. Knudsen?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryling?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
The final city manager report is emergency management initiatives resulting from Hurricane Irene, our lessons learned, and I think we have some friends from Dominion Power with us today as well. So, Jack?
During Hurricane Irene, as we were going through that, we asked all the city staff to report any problems or suggestions for improvements, and that resulted in a list of 28 items. And then in September, a staff committee made up of Assistant City Manager Jody Miller, Fire Chief Pat Dent, IT Director Mark Barham, and Senior Secretary in the Fire Department Nicole Fury, worked that and put together the report that you have before you now. In just a minute, I'm going to ask Chief Dent to come up and give you an overview of that. We put this on the agenda, and then I remembered something. I remembered at the time of the storm, I had talked with Melanie Beal at Dominion about inviting Dominion to come down and talk with the City Council, and frankly, I had neglected at the time we were working on this to schedule this. So I called her up late, as in this Monday, and said, we have this on the agenda. Would it be possible if you might be able to come to our meeting? And you can see what she was able to produce for us. So I particularly want to thank you, Melanie, for doing this on very short notice and making it possible for us to do both pieces of this today. So again, we'll start with Chief Dent and then go to Dominion.
Welcome, Chief.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Mayor Hallman, members of City Council, as City Manager has already informed you of how the committee was formed. As you're well aware, the arrival of Hurricane Irene on August the 27th of this year tested our emergency management capabilities. So in an effort to improve our ongoing emergency management operations, we solicited that input from city staff, and we came up with a list of 28 issues or problems that were identified and some suggested solutions, and the committee took these 28 problems and we met over a period of a couple months to look at each of the problems. So in the report you'll see that it has a stated problem, proposed actions, estimated cost, and identifies a responsible first person to handle that, to follow that problem through till completion. I think it's one thing that's important to note here is that every perceived problem that was submitted was included in the report. The committee didn't go through the report and eliminate things that we didn't think were issues. If it was a perceived problem, obviously it was an issue to somebody, so we've addressed it in the report. What I'd like to do is not to go through each and every item, but maybe just a couple items in each of the areas and highlight those, and then I'll answer any questions that you may have. In the public information area, one of the problems identified was that we had numerous people that were working in the public information office. They did a tremendous job. They had to put out a lot of information. We've heard a lot of positive feedback from the community about the information that went out. But one of the things, as they changed shifts, sometimes the information was sent out under the individual's personal email, and it created some confusion as the information went out. So already that problem's been addressed, and IT developed a communications at williamsburgva.gov, which is the PIO email address that will be used during events in the future. One of the things we also identified in the damage assessment area, when the damage assessment teams came in on Sunday, they went out, they had a spreadsheet that they entered information into, but when they came back, that spreadsheet didn't coincide with the spreadsheet that we're required to submit through WebEOC to the state for our damage assessment report. So in talking with the IT department and Mark Barm, he's going to create that report for a cumulative report, so we don't have to duplicate the work, that when they'll be entering that information into that report that gets directly submitted through WebEOC to the state. Fortunately, in our EOC operations, fortunately, we don't have that many events that require activation of the Emergency Operations Center. On the downside of that is sometimes folks don't feel comfortable that they know that they're comfortable with their role in the EOC. I'll say as the coordinator of emergency management, that wasn't obvious during Hurricane Irene that people were uncomfortable, but it was some comments that were sent to us afterwards. So, everybody's always concerned that they might make a mistake that negatively impacts our operations. So, as you'll see looking through the report, there's several situations that were identified that go back to possibly some EOC training. So we are going to plan some EOC training and exercise so that we can bring people in and that they become more comfortable with their role in emergency operations. One other thing that we identified through Hurricane Irene is that we need to have a logistics finance representative in the EOC to deal with some. Fortunately, during Irene, we didn't have too many purchases, but in a larger event, we may have some purchases, and it would be beneficial to have a financial representative there to handle some purchasing and logistics needs. As you're well aware also, this was the first time that we activated our own city shelter. I can't say enough about the staff that operated that shelter. The first time, it was tremendous operation there. We did identify some areas that we could improve. The shelter staff identified that we needed to have more additional medical supplies on site. Fortunately, something that's been in the works for several years, in the next couple weeks we should accept delivery of a shelter support unit, which will, it's a 17-foot trailer that's fully stocked with EMS supplies that will be kept at the Quarter Path Recreation Center, which is our shelter. This trailer was made possible through UASI funding, grant funding, and also some Hampton Roads MMRS grant funding. It's fully stocked. They'll maintain the stock as long as the grant funds are available. They'll inventory the trailer. So really, it was just a matter of us taking the trailer and having a place to put it, and they're going to take care of the rest. Another issue that came up is once the shelter operations, we ceased those operations. We didn't have any more shelteries there. In an effort to save some money, the power was not restored to Quarter Path Recreation Center, but in order to save fuel, we manually shut down the generator. We were quickly notified by our IT director that serves as the backup servers for the city's IT system. So we got the generator running again. We've already corrected that issue. We have signs posted everywhere so that generator doesn't get shut down until the power is restored. Another thing with the shelter is that came up is folks would like to have, because it is the instances are few and far between when we operate the shelter, that they'd like to have some job guides that once they walked in the shelter, they would have a checklist of what they're supposed to do for their position. We were already in the process of working through a new shelter plan with the Virginia Department of Health, and we are working on those job guides, so we should have those completed in the near future. A couple miscellaneous items that came up. As you know, the power outages throughout the city, folks had their windows open. We had some areas in residential neighborhoods where the generators at the sewer pump stations were in close proximity to the residential neighborhoods, and it created a lot of noise for those neighbors. So Public Works is going to research some methods to possibly reduce the noise from those generators. One other thing we identified in some of our trees down, I know you're going to hear a presentation from Dominion Virginia Power. One thing before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm, the city manager, myself, and Dan Clayton, we had numerous conference calls, face-to-face meetings with Dominion Virginia Power. We had some issues where we had trees down that were entangled in power lines, and city crews, we couldn't determine if those lines were energized, so they couldn't move forward, so it delayed sometimes getting the debris removed from the streets. In speaking with Virginia Dominion Power, we've requested that they give us a representative for the EOC in the next event. That person's responsibility would be to go out to this area, determine whether that line is de-energized so our crews could move forward to remove it. Another thing that's happened since then is from Virginia Dominion Power, in conjunction with our safety committee and James City County, we held a training session on overhead wiring safety. They have a really neat trailer that's able to reproduce some of the situations with live electricity that we face in storm situations, and we had about 40 city employees that attended that training. Those are kind of the highlights of the issues that you see in the report there. Obviously, as I was speaking with Mr. Tuttle, and I wasn't here during Isabel, but he provided me the report from Isabel, and this many fewer items and less extensive items than the 75 that were identified after Hurricane Isabel. And we anticipate as we move forward that any other EOC operations that are conducted that will continue as we review our procedures, that will continue to reduce the number of lessons learned for each and every event.
Chief, thank you very much. This is a terrific report. I think it shows. I hope you thank the committee people that were involved in this, but also a big thanks goes to the city staff who responded in each of these areas. And all of us like to see no cost on a whole lot of these, but they're really. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is there was a graduation earlier this week for members of the CERT teams, and I think they played an important role in this. And I know that class was supposed to have their final training, and they got it real time with the hurricane. But they are also an important part of what our emergency response. But thank you very much for this. And now, any questions? Any comments?
A comment. As difficult a situation as these incidents can be, it's encouraging to know that staff is using them as a learning improvement tool as well, so that with each successive challenge that we face, we do a better job. What's probably most interesting to me about this list, in addition to the relatively little costs involved, is that most of the issues seem to be internal to the city and not anything that would directly affect any of the citizens. So it's doing a terrific job on all accounts, and just appreciate everything that you all do, and the entire city did during that event, which, I mean, you all are leaving families at home to be here to take care of the rest of the residents of this community. We appreciate that.
Scott?
I'll just echo what Paul said, and I don't think I ran into you personally, but I know I did run into someone who's seen you, said you've been awake for about 2 days. So we all appreciate the lengths that everyone went to. I was out early the morning after, it was before 7 o'clock, and roads were clear, and it was a good feeling to know that someone was out all night. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the report. I can't tell you how proud I am of you and the fire department and all the city staff for all that you did during that storm. But to take the time to do this analysis so that we're better prepared in the future, I think, is a real testament to the quality of employees that we have at the city. So thank you.
Just a couple things. Once again, I want to thank Kate Hoving and whoever else put out this memo with all of the phone numbers. Mine is all messed up because I carried it around in my pocket the whole time because it's full of phone numbers and information. And it was great to have. The other thing is I ran into somebody the other day who told me that the tweets from the city kept him going during the hurricanes. The only way he could get any information. So that was really very good. The other thing is about one of these items. I only had 2 enormous complaints from my neighbors during the hurricane. One was the power, and the other was this number 26 about the debris pickup. And it seems to me you can't win. If you get it too early, then everybody objects because they didn't have time to get their stuff out. If you get it too late, they object because it's piled in front of their house. So I think we did a good job with it, although it is what I heard about from everybody. So, but on the whole, the city did a wonderful job. I'm pleased to hear about the shelter. I was intimately involved with the James City County shelter at one point, and that is not easy.
Again, I think this was an important learning experience, as they all are, and I think we are better prepared for the next one.
Yeah.
And thank you and all your staff, and thank you and the city staff for everything. And again, Kate in particular, thank you for the communications. I don't know how many people, both from the city and James City County and York County, that commented that thank you, Williamsburg, for keeping us informed. So thank you.
Miller and Michelle DeWitt and Dee Scott and Barry Walton.
A whole bunch of people, but thank you. Communications during these events are really critical, and the city did well, so thank you. Jack, back to you. And our next. Thank you,
Chief. Melanie Rapp with Dominion Virginia Power.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to attend today, and if I could take a brief moment, I totally want to echo, Mr. Mayor, and to the City Council, what a fantastic staff you have. I don't own stock in the city, so I'm being very genuine. They're very good people to work with. You can call them night or day, and they reply. They're fantastic. So you really have hired a great group of people. Now I'd like to briefly just introduce the Dominion staff that I'm honored to have with me. I have Max Bartholomew. He's our Senior External Affairs Manager and my boss. I have Mike Frederick here, Director of Planning, Reliability, and our GIS Services. I have Lester Pauls. He's the manager of our electric distribution for operations on the peninsula. And then beside him we have Kim Lowers. She's the manager of our construction for the peninsula, and she was the restoration manager during Irene for the Williamsburg area. So she's a wonderful lady. Now I'd like to ask Mr. I'm sorry.
Well, no, thank you for being here, and thank all of you for being here. We really do appreciate it.
Now I'd like to have Mr. Frederick to come forward, and he's going to share our PowerPoint presentation that we have on post-Irene storm restoration. And then Jack has asked us to, after we finish, if y'all have any questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them to the best of our ability. So thank you once again for this time.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, thank you for the opportunity. Melanie's already introduced me, so I won't do that again. I will say, Mr. Mayor, you mentioned that you take an opportunity, everybody takes a collective opportunity each time we have one of these events to learn something. And that's one of the themes you'll hear in this, which is each one of these storms is different. We learn something new every time that we have one. Irene was an unwelcome visitor, triggered the second largest storm restoration effort in Dominion's history. At the peak, 1.2 million customers out of service. 75% of those were restored by close of business by the end of the day on Wednesday. Almost 95% by the end of the day on Friday, and then the rest through Labor Day weekend. 35,000 different job locations is where our folks needed to work on to restore that. And of course, Williamsburg was not spared Irene's wrath. 92% of the 50,000 customers here were out during the peak of the storm. It was one of the unique things about this storm was inconsistent catastrophic damage. So basically, if you look at this, about 2/3 of our system had at least significant damage. And then in this band from Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, to Midlothian, Richmond, and up into Northern Neck, it was catastrophic. And it sounds like a number of you were around during Isabel. One of the things that was interesting in this band, Isabel produced winds in excess of 70 miles per hour, and this is, not everywhere is consistent. This is based on airport readings. In excess of 75 miles an hour for 17 hours. Irene did for 30 hours. So in a lot of ways, this storm was actually worse than Irene in significant parts of our system. The other thing that was unique was even in areas of significant damage, there were, of course, pockets of catastrophic, more so than other storms we've seen. So what did we do to prepare for Irene? A week before the storm's anticipated landfall, we mobilized 5,000 line and support personnel, including out-of-state crews and tree crews, pre-staged inventory and pre-staged poles, transformers, etc. And then one of the things that's the most important right after the storm is the assessment. So we lined up logistically vehicles and helicopters to be ready to go out, do the initial assessment as quickly as we could from a safety standpoint, get out as quick as we could safely. And that is, we look at safety performance every day as one of the most vital things that we do. It's paramount during our storm restoration effort, both from a public safety standpoint and from an employee and contractor perspective. We started issuing safety and storm tips via the media, dom.com, Twitter, Facebook, ahead of the storm, contacted medical needs customers so they could make alternative arrangements. And then, of course, during the actual restoration effort, again, from a public safety standpoint as well as employee safety, we want to make sure that we're working folks in weather that's safe, restoration weather that's safe, and giving them adequate rest time. Other things you've heard some already from the Chief's review, but daily conference calls with the EOCs and managers and coordinators. One of the things we do early in the year, typically in the spring, is storm preparation. That's where we identify critical facilities, critical service facilities, and we talk about and train the various EOCs on the tools that we have. We're pretty transparent from the information we put out there for EOCs to grab. Of course, the biggest question we get is, how do you do your restoration? And it's really, from a process standpoint, very simple. We know that for some customers it's the most frustrating because the bottom line is we start with the greater need. So you start with the transmission lines that are serving a large bulk of the population. You need to make sure they're available for service first. During that phase, we're also looking at hospitals, medical facilities, etc. Then we move to substations, which typically are providing a smaller block of customers, but still significantly large, and right on down the line to the last person. So the frustrating point for some customers is, I'm the one that's last. But that's the process that we use. That 5,000, that crew or group of 5,000 resources grew to more than 7,000, including 3,000 from partner utilities. I'm not going to read through all the work that was done, but it was significant. Of course, it was a costly restoration effort. Those costs, from a curiosity standpoint, we're one of the utilities that do not have a storm tracker mechanism in rates. So basically, those costs are operating costs that go into our rate base. And then, of course, again, customers, we're always looking to keep customers as well informed as possible. We had 1.7 million calls handled by our customer care center. Crew locations are posted daily on dom.com. That website reached 1.5 million hits. One of the things that's not on the next slide that I'll touch on that we learned is we were utilizing about 65% of our mainframe capability for the company during this event. So from an IT standpoint, we're making some improvements in that perspective in anticipation of the next storm, which we hope doesn't happen. But radio ads conveying critical safety and restoration messages, news releases, press briefings, and then, of course, Facebook and Twitter. It's very apparent that these devices have changed the world completely. When you compare, I was not around during Isabel, but when you compare the stories of Isabel compared to Irene, this is one of the biggest difference makers. So what we learned, there's basically 3 key learnings. The first is we need to continue the improvement spendings and investments we've made for reliability, including tree trimming. The third one, we need to continue to strengthen partnerships with the EOC and emergency managers. We have a very strong relationship, I think, with yours. They are very good. I'd echo what Melanie said. The thing that is clear, you, the customer, were not satisfied with ETRs, and we were not satisfied. The estimated restoration times that customers were getting. The model that we use on a typical storm works really well. did not work nearly as well as we would have liked it to have worked during the restoration of Irene. In fact, we didn't even have the restoration. It was just barely complete when our CEO put a team together and said, we need to look at this differently. This is not acceptable for the next time. So clearly we weren't satisfied with ETRs, customers weren't satisfied, and that's the thing that we're really focusing on from a customer satisfaction perspective.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, Melanie. But back up. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if council has any questions for you or any of your people, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Just when anybody's power goes out, it never comes back on soon enough. And with the debris issue, once you have your debris out and ready to go, it's never picked up soon enough. But both of those were monumental tasks. But the point you touched on was, I think people understand it's going to take time to accomplish some of these things. If we just have clear and I know you can't guarantee 100% accuracy on an estimated time to restore service, but the estimates that people were receiving were so drastically different from the reality. Could you just talk a little bit more about what went wrong there and how you're going to better supply these estimates in the future? Or maybe that's still a work in progress, but
it's still a work in progress. We've already made some modifications to the process. Let me touch on the first part of your question. Why was that an issue? And it really kind of boils down to downline damage. At a very simplistic level, the way our restoration communication process works, it's based on the device level. And in a typical storm, you can very well predict which devices are going to be the impactor to your service getting back on. In an event like this, like I said, we had 27 transmission lines across the system down, I believe. So you fix that. That might trigger one set of restoration communications. But then now you have the substation may be okay and you have a mainline circuit down now. That could trigger another level. That's our normal process. It's kind of complicated the way the communication works, but the bottom line is it was because there was so much downline damage all the way to the house that the ETRs were not so good. And that's the process we've changed for the size of storm. I don't know if that's very clear, but it was because of, quite frankly, the amount of catastrophic damage.
No, it's helpful, and I can also appreciate that it's particularly frustrating for people when they're some of the last to get their power back. And you have to establish priorities.
Well, the one thing I think we did really well in the communication was we said 75% across the system by the end of the day on Wednesday, which we met the 95. But if I'm the individual, we understand. If I'm still out, that doesn't mean much to me. So we understand that, and we want to improve that.
And thanks for taking the time to come and be here today.
Scott?
I guess my question kind of piggybacks off Paul's. Can you give us some estimation of storm-wide what percentage of damage was caused by, say, a transmission line in a right-of-way versus neighborhood damage?
I really can't give you that kind of estimate.
I got you.
If I knew it, I'd be happy to give you, but I don't really have that answer.
What I'm getting at is, as a city, is there a way that through more effective communication, we can help you all, either have more almost grounds to go in and trim trees, et cetera, using the city as kind of a conduit to get that information out, how it's directly tied to an event like hurricane?
You've definitely hit upon. I mean, an event like this, the tree issue is what causes most of the problem, obviously. I mean, there are other things, but that's the biggest issue. And, of course, we're also sensitive to the fact that if I have nice trees that are impacting our services, I don't really want Dominion to cut them.
Right.
However, if I want my service available in an event like this or something similar, it probably increases my odds if they're trimmed.
Sure.
So it's always a balancing act. And I think we do a nice job of respecting that balance for customers. But that's certainly one of the key things. I mean, some people would also say underground. Why isn't the whole system underground? And I mean, that can be done. It's a significant cost. But even that, if you have an underground, like in the city of Williamsburg, more than 50%, significantly more than 50% is underground service, which is fine until you have an issue with the underground service, and then it takes a lot longer to find and a lot longer to fix. So there's a trade-off between that, too.
Thank you.
I guess it's kind of along the same line. And you mentioned the numbers. Was it you had 5,000 on the ground before, then it turned to 7,
grew to 7,000,
and then 3,000 of which
came from outside.
So a percentage of those are contractors, as opposed to like a local line crew.
Yeah, some are contractors that's all they do. They're contract line crews. Okay. Some are from other utilities. So we had utilities from
like Duke
Duke.
Okay.
We had Duke, Progress, AEP. I mean, we had support personnel from other utilities. We call it mutual aid. Basically, we do the same thing in the Connecticut storm that's been in the papers recently. Dominion sent crews up there to help that utility.
Along that line, the same line as the previous question, is there a way that we can help these contract crews who probably are not familiar with Williamsburg? Is there a way we can facilitate them through our EMS and so forth?
Well, I think the relationship we have with your EOC and your emergency managers is the way to do that. I think it's strong here. We can always make it better, and that certainly is one thing that we could probably improve on a little bit.
Gotcha. And this is
sharing of information.
Right. And this is just a specific question, but are those contractors direct employees of Dominion, or are they independent? Meaning, if something were to happen with a contractor in the city and it were the contractor's fault, is that a liability of Dominion, or is that a liability to the contractor?
I'm not positive. I'm hesitating because it probably would depend a little bit on the situation.
Okay.
In a regular work day, we have contractors hired throughout our localities, putting in underground wire, building lines, and when the lines are built, they move on. We've had events where things do happen, and they've been held responsible for whatever occurred. In a situation, hurricane, I've seen it go both ways in an event like this, but we've stepped in and took over the whole whatever happened.
Gotcha.
One of the things that we do when we plan that work is attempt to make sure that we're not putting the contract, especially the contractor's mutual aid personnel, in a situation where they can hurt themselves or others.
Gotcha.
So there's, we use our folks who know the system very well for the more risky part of the restoration.
I think that's about it.
Great, thanks. Doug?
Thank you. Mr. Frederick, I appreciate you coming and making the presentation. I understand that trees on power lines was the greatest part of the power outage problem. And I don't know if this is true, but one of the things that I've heard is, given the relative age of the city and some of the infrastructure, that also was a problem. Is there a commitment on Virginia Power's or Dominion Power's standpoint to upgrade some of these facilities that we have in the city that are old?
Well, I'm not going to speak specifically to the city, but we've made considerable reliability investments over the last, really started about 6 years ago, but our reliability budget, which includes tree trimming, circuit reconditioning, capital asset rebuild, all those things that deal with aging infrastructure, we've grown that significantly, probably threefold in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's one of the things that was on the learning bullet is we've seen. There's some debate. Smart people can debate what I'm about to say, but there's a belief by a lot of the experts in our company that while those efforts may not have kept the numbers of people that went out of service down significantly, so in other words, 92%, maybe it would have been 100% otherwise. But the thing that it certainly helped with was the amount of time to come back. Mm-hmm. Because, again, this was a near Isabel storm for a lot of our system, and the restoration time was way less. And we recognize, again, anything more than a few hours is a problem.
And I appreciate that is a commitment, because that certainly is a concern of some of the residents that I've talked to. And just anecdotally, Talked to some of my fellow council and neighbors. It seems like 20 years ago we never lost power for 5, 6, 7 days. Is that true that we're out of power longer than we used to be? I mean,
I'll look to the local folks for that.
I mean, it just seems like now when we lose power, we're out for days. But
If you would come to the microphone, please. Thank you. This is televised.
Okay,
This way people who are watching.
I've been with the company 40 years and come up and did line work, climbed poles, and all my career has been part of restoration power. And to sit here and say the climate's is changing and things are getting worse, I'm not going to sit here and advocate that, but I can tell you, over the last 10 or 15 years, I've seen more 4-day events, 5-day events, such as that, than I did my first 30 years with the company. It just seems, Isabel is a once-in-a-life thing, Irene's and hit number 2. And then we had the ice storm, 99. So all these events are fairly fresh in our minds. But I tell you, the last 11 or 12 years was a whole lot different from my first 30.
Well, it has nothing to do with the power company, obviously. It's the circumstances that come along. But it just, thank you so much.
Thank you. Judy?
I guess I'm a little disappointed that underground wiring isn't on your lessons learned. I heard all the business about underground wiring, but it solves your tree problem, for one thing. You don't have to worry about trimming trees. The other thing is, anecdotally, again, I was doing my laundry in Kings Point, which is a neighborhood in James City County which has underground wires, which was on in 24 hours and never went off again. So I think it just seems to me with the new technology we should be paying. I know how expensive it is and all these kinds of problems, but in the long term, it's better to be out 24 hours than 9 days.
Well, yeah, and in our reliability program, I didn't say we weren't doing underground.
Yeah, I know. But
what I said was it's very expensive to go system-wide. Right. But in our reliability package, we look at strategic underground, and we do look at areas where if a tree solution can't be found, then we may underground that.
Yeah.
But again, for people that have underground service and have a fault or a break, they're harder to find and longer to restore normally. So a little bit of a trade-off.
Yeah.
If I could just interject, we do have a reliability project in Williamsburg that we've been trying to get done for the last 3 years, and it's been so difficult to obtain 100% of the easements necessary without resorting to any form of force taking, but rather asking citizens to give up the right-of-way to find places to locate the underground boxes. This is retrofitting in an existing neighborhood. Williamsburg, there's no question, any new neighborhood will have underground facilities. That the City Council took care of that back in the 1980s, saying any new facilities in Williamsburg will be underground. But the retrofitting is not only expensive, we've proven that it is very difficult to do practically. I haven't given up on this neighborhood yet. We're going to get there. But it's not been easy. And so I think as a practical matter, in terms of going back into existing neighborhoods and expecting retrofitting, both from financial and practical purposes, let's just say we're a long way from that.
Oh, I understand that. I know in Kings Point they did it when they replaced the sewer system. So, you're digging up the streets already kind of thing. But it just seems to me in the long run, it's going to save everybody a whole lot of money. So.
Well, I've lived on Newport Avenue for 40 years, and I can tell you reliability now is a whole lot better than it was 40 years ago. But I guess my question for you, are there any specific lessons learned that apply to Williamsburg? Anything that you would say that you as you look at the city, and we are unusual in many ways. We have a lot of underground, but a lot of very old neighborhoods, as you've heard and what have you. What have you learned that's you could say specific to Williamsburg that would be useful?
I'll make one comment, and then I'll ask Lester and Kim if they have any comment. I think the one comment for sure, and you might say, well, yes, this is obvious, but it is a strong reinforcement that the interaction we have with your emergency managers is critical. And anything from a communication standpoint, not unlike Mr. Foster was asking, anything that from a communication standpoint, from an improvement perspective, going both ways, it can help you, it can help us. So it's clear that can always be better.
Thank you.
Lester, Kim, do you have anything? Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your presentation. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next order of business is city attorney reports.
I have nothing.
Have nothing. I think there's no unfinished business. Is that correct? That brings us to new business, and I believe we have several things here. Mr. Vice Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, I move that effective January 1st, 2012, that City Council reappoint Elisa Manuel to the Williamsburg James City County School Board for a 4-year term to expire December 31st, 2015.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Knutson?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryling?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
I have another one. Mr. Mayor, I also move that City Council appoint to the Architectural Review Board David Steeman for a 4-year term to expire December 31, 2015, and Joe Hertzler to fulfill Demetrius Florakis' term to expire December 31, 2012, and to the Planning Commission, Demetrius Florakis and Chris Connolly for 4-year terms to expire December 31, 2015, and to the Board of Zoning Appeals, Dennis Kaiser and Drew Gruber for 5-year terms to expire December 31, 2016.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please, Ms. Scott?
Ms. Knutson?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryling?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Great. And just a matter of thanks to all of those individuals who both applied for, were interviewed for, and who were appointed to the various boards and commissions. They are a big part of the lifeblood of this city, so thank all of them for their coming service. Next order of business is scheduled meetings. Jack, is there anything?
No, I just would point out the 2 big events passed. A Christmas parade and grand illumination went off very well, and thanks to our fire and police, once again, who handled some very large crowds in town.
They were terrific events. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I'd
Yes.
just like to point out that the Housing Authority meeting scheduled for December 20th has been canceled.
Any questions? Any further comments? With that, we'll come to our next order of business, which is open forum. This is a time when anyone who wishes to address council on any matter may do so. If you wish to address council, please come forward, state your name and address, and make your comments. Seeing none, I believe we have some business for closed session.
We do. Mr. Mayor, I move to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing 2 personnel matters per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments and disciplinary matters.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Would you call the roll, please, Ms. Scott?
Ms. Knutson?
Aye.
Mr. Pons?
Aye.
Mayor Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Fryling?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
We'll take a 5-minute recess.